Mr. President, this is National Police Week. It's a time every year when we stop to pay tribute to our law enforcement officers around the country, the men and women in blue who serve us every day in my state of Ohio and in every state represented in this chamber. We also remember the brave law enforcement officers who tragically died in the line of duty. We can never forget this is a dangerous profession. The National Law Enforcement Memorial and Museum reported that 2020 was the deadliest year for law enforcement in decades. In Ohio alone, we sadly lost 6 brave law enforcement officers over the past year. Here in the Capitol, of course, we lost 3 officers over the past year, including on January 6th. In the course of our nation's history, more than 24,000 officers have died in the line of duty. I was proud to join colleagues in March in sponsoring legislation called the Protect and Serve Act, which would create federal penalties on those who would attempt to harm or kill a police officer. I believe Protect and Serve would send a strong message and help deter these crimes. Ultimately, I think it would make our men and women in blue safer and help save lives. This week, I urge my colleagues to join me in standing with the families of our fallen police officers and thanking them and thanking law enforcement for what they do every day to protect us. And one way we can express our gratitude is by passing laws that will assist them in their critical work to keep us safe. With that in mind, I'm also on the floor today to call on my colleagues to support our law enforcement officers by taking decisive action to help them to keep some of the deadliest drugs in the world from coming into our communities. It's not an overstatement to say that this is a matter of life or death. Overdose deaths in the United States have sadly reached a record high during the COVID-19 pandemic. According to recent data from the Center for Disease Control, 87,000 Americans died during the 12-month period between September 2019 and September 2020, the most recent data which we have. This can be directly attributed to the circumstances surrounding the pandemic. So many families feeling the pain of these losses. And sadly, based on the current trends, we expect calendar year 2020 in full to be even worse. What's the main driver of these overdoses and overdose deaths? Synthetic opioids, most notably fentanyl. Fentanyl is 50 times more powerful than heroin, relatively inexpensive, deadly, and incredibly addictive. For years, this has been coming to our shores from China, first predominantly through our mail system, and with our new legislation in place to prevent that from happening, much of it is now coming in through Mexico. In 2019, there were 70,630 deaths from opioids and other drugs, and more than half of those, 36,359, involved fentanyl, sometimes mixed with other drugs like cocaine or crystal meth or heroin. So again, fentanyl, of all the poisons, fentanyl is the most deadly. It does have a medical purpose and can be used to treat patients in severe pain in the same way that morphine is used. Both fentanyl and morphine are classified under Schedule II by the drug enforcement authorities. In order to avoid prosecution under that scheduling order, drug traffickers started making slight modifications to fentanyl, creating what we call fentanyl analogues or fentanyl-related substances, essentially copycat fentanyl. Evil scientists in places like China, Mexico, India, working in unregulated pharmaceutical plants, will make a slight modification to fentanyl, sometimes adjusting a single molecule to create what are essentially these fentanyl copycats. While these copycats may have the same narcotic properties as fentanyl, these tiny variations allow these traffickers to evade prosecution. Oftentimes, by the way, these fentanyl-related substitutes, these copycats, are even more powerful than fentanyl itself. Take, for example, carfentanil. These fentanyl-related substances are the reason I'm on the floor today. In 2018, in recognition of the growing threat these copycats pose to our public health, the DEA temporarily scheduled fentanyl-related substances as Schedule I, the highest designation they can give. Since then, we've passed 2 temporary extensions of that designation. Most recently, Congress passed a 5-month extension just ahead of the previous deadline of May 6th, just a couple weeks ago, and President Biden signed that legislation into law last week. I supported that temporary extension because the alternative was worse. The only alternative was to let these substances become legal But I don't think kicking the can down the road for another 5 months is nearly enough to safeguard against the threat of copycat fentanyl. We need to do much more between now and when this temporary scheduling extension expires in October. Law enforcement needs certainty, and the drug cartels and those evil scientists need to know we are serious in addressing this problem, that there will be consequences. We need a permanent solution. Specifically, let's pass bipartisan legislation I introduced with my colleague, Senator Manchin, called Fight Fentanyl, which simply says let's not allow these illicitly manufactured and deadly synthetic opioids to suddenly become legal again. That's what law enforcement wants. That's what our communities demand. That's what we deserve to give them. It's long overdue that we make this designation permanent. I know some of my colleagues oppose permanent scheduling of these fentanyl drugs because they are concerned about mandatory minimum sentences and also that it could hinder research into future medications to treat addiction. Let me address both of those quickly. First, there's this concern about the harsh punishments that don't fit the nature of the crime. I share that concern. That's why our legislation ensures that mandatory minimum sentences are not automatically imposed in any criminal case. We want the judge to look at the severity of the crime and consider all relevant factors in sentencing. So that issue has been addressed in our bipartisan legislation. There's been a great deal of conversation about the impact of prosecutions and incarcerations on specific populations, including minority communities. What's often lost in this debate, I will say, is the growing impact of fatal overdoses in those same communities. Since 2016, while white fatalities have decreased through the period of 2019, the data we have shows that overdoses from opioids among Black Americans, particularly Black men, have actually gotten worse, not better. From 2011 to 2016, that same time period, when white overdoses and deaths were reduced, Black Americans had the highest increase in synthetic opioid-involved overdose deaths compared to all populations. And while 2017 to 2018, overall opioid-involved overdose fatalities decreased by just over 4%, rates among Black and Hispanic Americans actually increased. This is an issue we must address here. Another issue my colleagues have raised, again, is concern that permanently scheduling fentanyl and its analogs somehow hinders research into treating addiction. First of all, I agree. We need this research. We need it badly. One example of this is coming up with naloxone, a miracle drug based on heroin that actually reverses the effects of an overdose. I spoke to the scientist, Roger Crystal, just last week, who developed the nasal version of this naloxone. It's a miracle, and I've seen it work, and it saves lives. Researchers have told me there are barriers to being approved to legally research Schedule I substances. There's also a stigma to conducting this kind of research, even though we know that it could lead to the development of new treatments. But this is something we can easily address by allowing qualified researchers the ability to study fentanyl analogs under Schedule II as opposed to Schedule I. So we can address that issue. I'm open to working with my colleagues to address these barriers. And I believe that we can do that through the legislation creating the flexibility in the registration system for scientists. But I would urge my colleagues that we need to use the next 5 months to do the hard work of finding a permanent solution to this crisis before we have to once again run the risk of letting these drugs become legal, and the message that sends and the deaths that would occur as a result. The United States Senate can take the lead and permanently classify these dangerous narcotics that are literally killing tens of thousands of our fellow citizens every year. Instead of kicking the can down the road, again, for 5 months from now, let's make it permanent. The House and the Biden administration should support this effort. Lives are at stake. It's important that we continue to focus in this body, as we have, on the demand side of this equation. Prevention, treatment, longer-term recovery for fentanyl and for other substances. But it's also important that we not allow these substances to come on the streets at lower and lower costs and greater volumes. That is what would happen if we do not move as a Congress to ensure that these fentanyl copycats and fentanyl itself remains illicit drugs as they are. Let's do the right thing for our communities, do the right thing for law enforcement. Let's be sure they have the predictability and certainty in law enforcement to know that these criminals can be prosecuted, these traffickers. We need to act now to address the threat of these deadly fentanyl drugs coming into our communities. I urge the Senate to pass the Fight Fentanyl bill. Join us in this effort so we can better work to reverse the tragic rise in overdose deaths around the United States of America. I yield the floor.